between NATO and Ukraine are necessary to prevent further conflict and annexation by Russia. It is for this reason that we affirm the following resolution. Resolved, NATO should strengthen its relationship with Ukraine in order to deter further Russian aggression. In order to clarify the resolution, we offer the following definitions. NATO, the international organization of Western nations dedicated to collective defense against aggression, of which Ukraine is not a member. Strengthen relations, to increase military or economic assistance. Further Russian relations and aggression, an increase in amount or duration of force by Russia against the sovereignty or political independence of another state. We first contend that NATO intervention is necessary to prevent further annexation in Ukraine. Subpoint A. Russia currently has intention of annexing more parts of Ukraine. Foremost, Bloomberg News reports on May 19th that Russian lawmakers are preparing a treaty to officially annex Crimea. BBC News reports on May 30th that Russia has been arming militants in eastern Ukraine with weapons and artillery. Additionally, 30 of the separatists killed in recent attacks have been Russian volunteers. Russia is acting militarily within Ukraine. Deutsche Welle reports on April 2nd that annexing Crimea will ensure Putin economic and military routes to the Black Sea, as well as a buffer between NATO and its home borders, both of which Russia has been pursuing for many years. Eastern Ukraine serves as a valuable asset to Putin, and it is clear that aggression will continue as a result. Subpoint B. NATO is capable of preventing Russian aggression. First off, NATO training in the Ukrainian military has already been proven successful. According to the Kiev Post on June 3rd, NATO-trained Ukrainian forces repelled over 500 armed separatists without sustaining any casualties. The article also reports that providing successful border security would only require an additional 2,000 Ukrainian troops heavily trained and equipped by NATO. Lastly, according to Pravda News, April 4th, NATO's total defense budget is 10 times that of Russia, allowing them far more access to resources and entities. It is clear that NATO is capable of reacting efficiently and deterring more Russian aggression. Secondly, we contend that NATO intervention is necessary to protect former Soviet states. Subpoint A. Russia has intention of annexing former Soviet states. Deutsche Welle reports on May 29th that the Russian parliament has proposed legislation for vote that will allow people in former Soviet states to gain citizenship of Russia while living in Eastern Europe. Additionally, many nations in Eastern Europe show fear of Russian annexation. Moscow funds the Russian-speaking populist media in Latvia and many former Soviet states, glorifying the annexation of Crimea. Russia has a habit of making autonomous states of these regions, as they did to Transnistria in 1992. Russia has used it as a staging ground for troops ever since. Russia has made it clear in many ways that aggression will continue in Eastern Europe. Subpoint B. NATO is necessary in order to most effectively deter Russian aggression against other former Soviet states in the future. According to a Forbes article published March 13th, if one nation opposes Russian aggression, it does not send a strong, unified message to Russia, increasing their likeliness to continue aggression. However, if an international community takes a strict stance in opposition, it serves a greater deterrence. Moreover, NATO also has member states within Europe and neighboring Ukraine, meaning that they have an obligation to protect their members and making them a more logical force. Lastly, we contend that deterrence by NATO would be greatly beneficial to Western nations. Subpoint A. An end to Russian aggression and conflict in Ukraine would solve financial and displacement problems in Europe. The International Monetary Fund calculates that Ukraine will need $18 billion. Also, CNN Money reports that Russia ended natural gas shipments to Ukraine this Monday, costing billions more. Additionally, UNHCR reveals that the conflict has spawned over 10,000 refugees into neighboring countries as of May 20th. So long as instability continues in Ukraine, the rest of Europe will be burdened. Subpoint B. Preventing further Russian annexation will prevent the spread of Russian Eurasianism, a belief that Russia is the central cultural and political power between Asia and Europe. It upholds negative views such as xenophobia and anti-Americanism. Russia has already acted upon these in the past, and most notably in the Chechenian conflict that claimed the lives of 50,000 civilians and led to the deportation of another 600,000, according to the New York Times. I stated earlier that Russia has signed legislation on May 29th, proving that they have the intention of creating a Eurasian empire. According to the Global Post, 70% of Russian citizens claim to be hostile towards foreigners. Intervention by NATO is necessary to prevent the further spread of Russian Eurasianism. In conclusion, NATO ought to strengthen its relationship with Ukraine. Doing so will protect Ukraine as well as former Soviet states, and it would be beneficial for the West in general. For these reasons, we affirm.
I believe this is yours.
Are my opponents ready?
Yes.
All judges ready? Partner? Okay.
We negate today's topic. Resolve, NATO should strengthen its relationship with Ukraine in order to deter further Russian aggression. Before we begin, we offer the following observations. First, the affirmative burden of proof is to prove that NATO is necessary to deter Russian aggression and that Russia's government is aggressing in the status quo. Second, we define aggression as a violation of Ukraine's territorial and political sovereignty. Third, the standard of today's debate shall be consequentialism, meaning that the merits of an action shall be weighed on its effects. And with that said, we have three major contingents. Contingent 1, de-escalation of conflict. Our first main argument displays how the crisis in Ukraine will de-escalate, as well as how NATO has no role to play in it. Bando of the Cato Institute, March 2014, states that the diplomatic discussion is the key to solving the Ukrainian crisis, as it satisfies all parties involved with the conflict. Furthermore, this diplomatic solution is being formed. According to Heritage of Reuters, June 2014, a mutual understanding to de-escalate the crisis was achieved by Ukrainian and Russian presidents Poroshenko and Putin on June 9th. The Associated Press, June 18, 2014, furthers this, showing how Poroshenko has created a plan to mellow separatist actions in eastern Ukraine. Gumuchin of CNN, April 2014, explains how NATO has absolutely no role to play in the resolution of this crisis, as Russia recently recalled its ambassadors to NATO due to rising tensions. Any diplomatic appeal by NATO will simply be rejected by Russia. The Cato Institute further informs that NATO's alternative to diplomacy, military aid, will only aggravate Russia further. The impact is clear. De-escalation of the Ukrainian crisis is already occurring and NATO has no role whatsoever to play in its resolution. Contingent 2, exacerbation. Our second main argument explains how NATO will be ineffective at solving the Ukrainian crisis. Subpoint A, lack of commitment. NATO nations have seen a lack of commitment which threatens their capability to solve problems of the international community. Alexander of Reuters, May 2014, points out how America provides the most support for NATO operations. The disproportionate support harms NATO's cohesion and ability to solve crises. Thompson of Fourth, May 2014, furthers on how this disproportionate support is caused by a conflict of interest that exists between European nations and America. European nations have begun to aid Russia. On June 17, 2014, according to Birnbaum of the Washington Post. Subpoint B, historical precedent. Historical precedent shows how NATO intervention will not be a success. Schindler of National Interest, August 2012, shows how NATO intervention in Bosnia led to a terrible war without providing any reforms to the people whatsoever. Faust of PBS News, March 2012, shows how in Kosovo, NATO intervention led to the displacement of 150,000 Serbians. The impact of this is evident. NATO intervention will not work, as displayed through the lack of commitment and historic precedent. Contingent 3, Russian backlash. Our third main argument displays how NATO-Ukraine relations will result in Russian retaliation to Afghanistan and Iran. Subpoint A, Afghanistan. Rotnam of Bloomberg, February 2014, reports that NATO will begin withdrawing some of its troops from its operations in Afghanistan in December of this year. Panda of the Diplomat, March 2014, says that the key to this withdrawal is a supply route that runs through Russia known as the Northern Distribution Network. Burns of the Associated Press, May 2014, reports that as NATO-Russian tensions rise, Russia will eventually retaliate by prohibiting NATO travel and withdrawal through the NDN. The Diplomat furthers on how this cutoff would force NATO to revert to an alternative route through Pakistan. Mulreen of the Christian Science Monitor, March 2014, outlines how this endangers the withdrawal operations due to protesters and insurgents that frequent the routes. Subpoint B, Iran. Mousavian of All Monitor, March 2014, reports that NATO-Ukraine relations have been disrupting the P5+1 nuclear talks regarding Iran's nuclear program. This disruption encourages Russia to aid Iran in acquiring nuclear weapons and material in order to display its resistance to NATO's expanding hegemony in Eastern Europe, according to Charbonneau of Reuters, May 2014. Yet this will eventually cause conflict. The development of Iran's nuclear program would eventually result in an Israeli military strike against Iran, according to Goldenberg of the Associated Press, March 2014. The impact of this is twofold. First, NATO results in a cutoff of the Northern Distribution Network, which endangers the withdrawal operation from Afghanistan. And secondly, NATO-Ukraine relations will cause proliferation in Iran, which results in an Israeli conflict. And for all of these reasons, we must negate.
Judges ready? Can I have the first question, please? Sure. Okay, so you say that it disrupts the Northern Distribution Network. Are you saying that the only route to withdraw troops from Afghanistan is the Northern Distribution Network?
Actually, no. What I'm pointing out in my case is that there is an alternative route that runs through Pakistan, but the problem with this alternative route is that it's frequented by protesters, insurgents, and terrorists. Now,
okay, so we can't fly out troops.
We're showing also in response
actually, you have evidence saying that there's only 10,000 troops that are in continental Europe, which greatly decreases the impact of your argument.
We're not talking about
I know, but if there's only 10,000 troops that have the ability to travel over land, then therefore there are obviously other opportunities to withdraw troops from Afghanistan.
Remember, we're not talking about transferring troops from continental Europe. We're talking about withdrawing troops from Afghanistan.
Exactly. There's 10,000 NATO troops that live or are stationed in continental Europe. Therefore, meaning that your argument only impacts towards those.
I'm sorry,
which
I don't
decreases
understand the
impact of
relation
your
between
argument.
continental Europe and Afghanistan.
Okay, NATO nations live in continental Europe, and there's only 10,000 troops located in continental Europe. So therefore, the impact of your argument is decreased greatly because there are other opportunities to withdraw the other 40,000 NATO troops who could easily fly out or ship out from Afghanistan, and much easier opportunities. So therefore, if you haven't provided any sort of weight between deporting Afghanistani troops and increased Russian aggression.
But is this withdrawal operation through air support, is it affordable?
Absolutely, it's affordable.
I
The
can
United
provide-
States military has proven that it has the
I'd love to
ability
see that evidence after cross-examination.
Okay, absolutely.
Now, can I have a question?
Yes.
Okay, so in your first contention, you talk about, in your first and second contention, you talk about the annexation of Crimea and the Soviet Union, correct?
Yes.
Can you provide me the dates for these pieces of evidence?
Yeah, I'll provide it to you after crossfire.
Sure.
Dates of
Can I have
annexation.
another question, or would you like one?
No, I would like a question.
Sure.
So you talk about how this could eventually lead to nuclear weapon backlash. Are you aware of the term mutually assured destruction?
That's not exactly what my argument is referencing.
Okay, then what is your argument referencing?
We're saying that as NATO-Ukraine relations increase, so do NATO-Russian tensions. And in response to these tensions rising, we're basically going to see that
Are you aware that if
Can you please
are
let
you
me finish?
Yeah, sure.
Okay, so basically what we're saying is that in response to these NATO-Russian tensions, Russia will retaliate upon the P5+1 nuclear talks and aid Ukraine in developing its nuclear weapons.
Aid Ukraine?
Aid Iran, sorry.
Okay, are you aware that aiding Iran directly violates Russia's national interests?
Can you please provide me that evidence?
Okay, if Russia provides Iran with nuclear weapons, they can easily provide it to the Taliban. And the Taliban was founded on principles that actually were anti-Russian. So therefore, you can easily see opportunities for nuclear weapon backlash.
Again,
which my
I'd like to
opponents
see
have-
that evidence again after cross-ex.
All right, we will show you the evidence. But also, you have to bear in mind that although
That's time.
Okay, yeah, that's fine.
Okay, so I'd like to request a couple pieces of evidence. First one would be the one about the Northern Distribution Network, how
Wait.
there is an air altercation.
It's my speech.
Oh, so can we have the evidence before our speech then?
Yeah, well, I would say with regards to when Russia annexed Crimea, that's common knowledge. But yeah.
It's
Well,
just-
yeah, it's my speech. I won't be taking credit. All right, all judges ready? Yep. Okay, so I'd first like to state that it's the burden of the affirmative in this round to show that on net benefit, NATO intervention within the Ukrainian crisis would either be net beneficial to the Ukraine, Eastern Europe, or the West as a whole. With that in mind, my opponent has stated their framework is that we must prove that NATO is capable of deterring Russia and there's evidence of Russian aggression still remaining. We agree to this as well and therefore have affirmed the resolution on both my opponent's framework and our own, as we will prove in this debate. So my opponent's first contention is that NATO prevents de-escalation of the conflict, or that NATO involvement would do so. First off, I would like to say that this is not true. According to NATO Deputy Secretary Alexander Vershbow, NATO has been involved in the Ukrainian crisis since April 4, 2014, and since then we have not seen any great increase in Russian aggression. In fact, as of May 31st, according to the Washington Post, Russia has withdrawn over 2/3 of its troops in the area, meaning that, if anything, Russia is showing less signs of aggression since NATO involvement, meaning that by all means NATO is not provoking Russia. Now, my opponent has stated that NATO intervention within the Ukrainian crisis will prevent diplomacy. First off, this is simply illogical for a number of reasons. First, my opponents must prove that Russian President Vladimir Putin has actually been open to peace talks and must actually provide warrant for this. Secondly, my opponent must prove that a treaty, or that Russia would be willing to accept such a treaty. Third, my opponent must warrant the fact that a treaty would be better in the end than actual NATO military aid and assistance to the Ukraine, and until they can impact this point does not bear weight. Fourth, according to the Heritage Foundation, Putin has not been trustworthy in the past with such international agreements. For example, a rational leader that can be trustworthy in international negotiations and diplomacy is not going to simply violate all international law by invading the Ukraine or Georgia and Chechnya in the past, meaning that we can't trust diplomatic negotiations with a ruler such as Vladimir Putin. So with that in mind, I would also like my opponent must warrant the fact that somehow a treaty would be better than military intervention on behalf of NATO or military assistance. And lastly, my opponent has to warrant the fact that, or you got to bear in mind the idea that in order for such a negotiation and diplomacy to be taken seriously with Russia, NATO needs a backing show of force, or the Ukraine, or whatever act of diplomacy is being guaranteed in order to give such negotiations credibility. Now, my opponent's second contention is that essentially NATO would further exacerbate the situation. This has simply not been true since NATO has intervened as of April 4th, and we haven't seen an increase in Russian aggression. Secondly, they stated that NATO would be ineffective in acting as a whole. I would like to state that this is not true, given that NATO has already voted unanimously in favor since April 4th of involving itself in the Ukrainian crisis. Additionally, to essentially, bear with me here, to state that NATO should intervene within the Ukrainian crisis, given that NATO is nothing more than its member states acting collectively, it's not an institution separate from its members, is to state the same thing as NATO member states should collectively strengthen ties with Ukraine to deter Russian aggression. Now, in a debate, specifically with a should resolution, you're not debating whether or not an actor would be willing to pursue such a policy. You're debating whether or not an actor should pursue such a policy. Essentially, this is the fiat power of the affirmative in a debate round. With that in mind, we can see that such groups would be willing, or such NATO members would be willing, according with fiat power, to act within the crisis in Ukraine. Additionally, my opponent mentioned the crisis in Bosnia. I would like to state that according to Foreign Affairs and the Christian Science Monitor, this 100,000 dead that my opponent mentioned were killed before NATO intervened. You had the Bosnian dictator, more or less, Milosevic. Essentially, what he was doing was ethnic cleansing within Bosnia, killing off the Bosniaks. And after NATO intervened, according to both the Foreign Affairs and the Christian Science Monitor, tensions were greatly decreased, and overall NATO came out successful without suffering any casualties in the conflict. So specifically with Bosnia, NATO has proven itself successful. So for all these reasons, I urge an affirmative ballot. Thank you.
Before the negative begins its prep, we'd like to request some pieces of evidence. So
What
the
others?
first one I'd like to request is that there has been NATO involvement since April 4th, 2014, and that it's been unanimous. The second one is that there's an air alternative to the Northern Distribution Network, and the third one is that Russia would not like to give Iran nuclear weapons.
And also,
First off, Iran with nuclear weapons and other options being available for trade, that's your burden to provide. I do have this evidence here. And NATO votes unanimously. That's goes
Okay.
without.
Okay, got it.
that
So
was 10 seconds of prep.
let me just switch them around. Let's see them. Oh, one sec. Let me just resume my prep right now. Okay, okay, that's good. So I've used a total of 15 seconds, and I will begin my speech now. Are my judges ready? Sure. Opponents ready? Here you go.
Thanks.
And partner ready. 4 minutes. My time starts now. So as the second speaker on the negative side, I'll be addressing my opponent's framework in case, if time permits, I'll be defending my own. So let's start off with framework. Remember, we must agree that if they don't prove that Russian aggression is coming out of Russia's government and now the actions are solely Russian separatists that can't be controlled by Russia, this is no longer Russian aggression. Realize that there's a civil war going on right now, which is Russian separatists. These are extremists that Russia's government can control. If we prove that only the extremists are the one acting and everything else no longer exists because of the diplomatic talks, we win the debate. With that in mind, let's jump into their case. So their first contention talks about the necessity of NATO support. Their first subpoint talks about how Russia wants to annex Crimea as of May. Realize that Russia's already annexed Crimea. Now they're bringing up how we need to be preventing these kinds of things. Realize that, first of all, this is not a violation of international law. The reason Russia even went into Crimea is because of the fact that there was a civil war. Pro-Russian separatists, according to the Foundation for Democracy, were being persecuted by pro-Ukrainian patriots. Therefore, what they had to do was go intervene and basically equalize the crisis. Unfortunately, this actually made the civil war tensions worse because the fact that Russia turned the game around, what they did is they helped the pro-Russian separatists fight the pro-Ukrainian patriots. However, now this has de-escalated. What we're showing you is that Russia has actually denounced all support for these separatists, according to an evidence from Russian Times just 2 weeks ago. On top of that, I'd like to point out that because they're not helping these separatists, we can't call this Russian aggression. On top of that, they don't give you any example of Russian aggression in the past 2 weeks since the diplomatic talks commenced on June 9, 2014, right? Then you drop their argument because they give you an example of 30 Russian separatists coming from Russia. One, that's 30 people, but on top of that, this was before the diplomatic talks commenced. To their second subpoint, where they talk about an evidence from the Kyiv Post, where they basically say that they help NATO's military. Now, what is their evidence saying? They're actually completely misconstruing it. Their evidence says that NATO's been involved since April 4, 2014. It says that they use sanctions to help Ukraine. First of all, I'd like to point out that sanctions have historically failed, according to Ezra Levin from the Toronto Sun. On top of that, I'd like to point out that because these sanctions are failing, NATO actually regressed its overall diplomatic commitment because the fact that Russia rejected NATO's diplomacy. Let me point out that if NATO tries to diplomatically intervene, we're going to be seeing more Russian backlash, and the diplomatic talks that are currently in place will collapse. But realize that if NATO used military force, this would actually instigate the crisis even more, because according to CNN, then Russia would realize that NATO has now labeled it as an adversary under the 1997 treaty that NATO signed, saying that it would not militarily aggress Russia. Otherwise, it automatically makes the two adversaries, and then we get Russian backlash, which is our third contention, which they dropped in their speech. Going on to the second argument, where they talk about protecting Soviet states. So their first contention talks about how Russia can annex countries in Eastern Europe. Realize that this threat has already dropped. Russia stated it's never going to be annexing anything other than Crimea, and this was largely because of the humanitarian rights doctrine and just protecting these pro-Russian separatists, which has already happened, done and gone. Russia will no longer be annexing anything other than Crimea. These are all past threats that have already diminished. On top of that, let me point out that Ukraine has already begun the diplomatic talks, and on top of that, realize that NATO will not be able to help these countries. First of all, I'd like to point out that NATO signed a treaty which said that they would not be giving military aid to former NATO nations that surround Ukraine, because the fact that it basically goes against this 1997 treaty. This would basically instigate Russia further, which is basically classifying response to their first contention. And on top of that, I'd like to point out that in their subpoint B, they say that all countries are going to be necessary. Realize that a conflict of interest exists. Now, we asked them if this was unanimous. They just say, remember that NATO always acts unanimously. That's wrong. There needs to be a majority vote, and there's not going to be one, because the fact we show you European countries are actually in favor of Russia. We can't allow an organization that's divided over helping Russia or not helping them to go and intervene, because it would just exacerbate the tensions more, creating more harms to NATO as well. Then to the third contention, where they talk about how this is actually going to be solving displacement. So they basically talk about how the gas cutoff causes instability. Then they go on to say how Russia's going to create an empire. First of all, they don't show you how they're going to be solving for this. The only solvency my opponents present in this entire debate is helping Ukraine's military. Realize that this is the exact thing Russia is afraid of, and it's the first thing that Russia would have backlash to from our evidence that we already point out. On top of that, I want to remind you that there is no longer Russian aggression. Remember that the presence of Russia has completely diminished after it decreased its support for these separatists. At that point, because my opponents can't prove Russian existence is even a problem, we must negate today's topic. Thank you.
Judges ready? May I have the first question?
Go ahead.
Okay, so with regards to your third contention, you stated that Russia would be capable of closing a supply route to Afghanistan. Now, basically, are you claiming that NATO, because Afghanistan has closed this route, would have absolutely no other means of withdrawing troops other than this Pakistan
so now
route?
let me point something out, because you did say it is our burden, so I will provide you with what you're asking for. First of all, I'd like to point out that previously NATO was using the Pakistan route. However, they realized that the Pakistan route was unsafe, so they actually ended up spending more money, hitting its very defense cap in order to go through the NDN. They're already pushing the limit on their spending. They're not going to be able to spend more to go through this air retreatment, which means they would have to go back to Pakistan. Realize this endangers 50,000 troops.
My question is, or rather phrase it this way, do you believe that NATO would not be willing to fly its troops out via air travel or send troops out over boats?
Remember, we're showing you that NATO could barely afford
Do
the
you have
NDN.
evidence to support this claim?
Yes, I have evidence. It's in my case.
Provide
If you'd
that,
like to
please.
see it. Yeah, sure. So now may I have a question?
Yes.
Okay, so can you give me an example of Russian aggression since June 9, 2014?
Okay, again, we would like, one, could you provide that evidence? Secondly, we'd like to state that Russia has been arming separatists, and again, reinforce the fact that according to both Foreign Affairs and the Christian Science Monitor, statements from Russia, this is just a general analysis of Russia published this year. Russian statements cannot be trusted. Again, a country that has committed so much aggression and attacks against nations in the past, clearly statements from such a nation can't be taken with
Okay,
grain
realize
of
that
salt.
Russia never actually violated international law. They were just protecting the pro-Russian separatists under the humanitarian rights doctrine, which is the key loophole to the Budapest Memorandum.
Okay, Budapest Memorandum. I'm glad you bring that up. The Budapest Memorandum was nothing more than a note written up by a German banker that nations signed. It was never ratified and
Isn't that a
holds no
contradiction on
international
your
law.
part? Because then if it's-
Additionally, Article 4 of the Budapest Memorandum states that no state shall commit aggression against another, which Russia already violated when it
But
began
remember that
annexing
the Budapest
Ukraine.
Memorandum, right after the statement you just said, says unless it's in accordance with the UN Charter, and the UN Charter states that any state can intervene to protect the humanitarian rights doctrine, which is what Russia did according to the
Russia
foundation
was
of
arming
democracy.
separatists within eastern Ukraine, meaning that this was in no way a means of protecting citizens
And
within
I
the
get that, and that's why Russia realized its mistake and now is commencing peace talks, and that's why there was a ceasefire happening just 2 days ago, and there hasn't been Russian aggression.
And
Since
regarding
that's why you
peace
can't prove
talks,
it.
can you provide evidence to show that one, these would be reliable, and secondly, that they would have actual impact beyond
These
military
peace talks were
assistance
commissioned by
from
the
NATO,
United
which we've
Nations
proven
and
are
German
successful.
Chancellor Angela Merkel. On top of that, Russian President Vladimir Putin and Petro Poroshenko have both agreed to these peace talks and have called for a ceasefire.
Again, can you provide a warrant showing that statements from Vladimir Putin have been truthful
Yes.
in the past, or that we can trust these?
Yes, exactly,
Would you
because
please
Vladimir
provide
Putin
that?
himself was only protecting the UN Charter. Now, may I have a question again?
Yes.
Okay, so moving on to your argument where you say we must protect these Baltic states, how do we do this?
Again, essentially, the Ukraine is the linchpin, and by an international community such as NATO taking a strong stance in opposition to Russian aggression, it sends a unified
Do you
message
say we
that
should
such
put,
action is not okay.
we should put troops in Ukraine?
I'm not advocating for troops on the ground, as you stated, this would advocate Russia, so much as military and economic assistance.
All right, thank you.
Judges ready? For a brief roadmap before I begin, I will be going defense and offense. So my first contention is talking about how we need to have NATO intervention in order to prevent further annexation of Ukraine. Now, my opponents are saying that it was rightful for Russia to actually intervene and annex Crimea because there was a violation of international law. Now, this is untrue because Russia was actually arming a pro-Russian separatist, so therefore their attacks against our case falls. Now, they also advocated for dates of annexation. We have provided these. They have made no claims against this, so therefore their attacks against our own case still stand. Now, our second point talks about how Eastern Europe and how we need to prevent Russian aggression and Eurasianism from expanding towards Eastern Europe and Russia's further expansion towards other Baltic states. Now, they have said that there was a Russian statement saying that President Vladimir Putin is not advocating for the further expansion of further Baltic states. They have not provided any statements or any warrants for this, so please negate the actual impact of these statements. Now, also, you have to bear in mind that Putin is completely untrustworthy and that if you look towards past examples, you can't trust Putin's opinion. Now, they also say that NATO won't provide aid. They have not actually provided any logistic evidence. Now, they also say that we have to have a majority that act. Again, you have to affirm with pro's ability to provide fiat power. Fiat power basically means that we have the benefit of actually saying that NATO intervention will happen regardless. So any arguments against their second point, please cross-apply that towards their second point, thus fall. Now, on to our last point, we talk about how this would produce Western instability and Eurasianism. They say that we have not provided any solvency. We provided economic solvency and military solvency, which they have not had any negation to. So therefore, all three of our points stand, and according to our framework, our whole contention still stands. Now, going back over to their case, they talk about how de-escalation of the conflict will NATO will increase aggression. Now, you have to look that thus far this hasn't increased. So therefore, that point still stands. We've also proven while diplomacy hasn't worked, they have not proven that Putin is still open to peace talks, or that Putin would accept a treaty, or that a treaty would be better than intervention. So therefore, all of those key points as to why there is actually actual impact within their first point falls, because you can clearly see that NATO intervention is more pertinent. Now, moving on to their second contention, they talk about how this would exacerbate the conflict, and they talk about how NATO would be ineffective because many countries would oppose NATO intervention. For the reasons previously stated, I urge a pro ballot.
Opponents ready? Yes. Judges ready? Partner ready? Yes. Okay. So judges, remember that in the second cross-examination, my opponent conceded to my partner that there will be backlash because and aggravation because of NATO military intervention. So that's why you have to disregard their first and second contention, because that is exactly what they reference. They reference military intervention, and thus they basically you can turn their argument because of the fact that NATO intervention will cause all this aggravation and backlash. Now let's move on to the negation side of today's debate, where our first contention is de-escalation. My opponents basically say that we can't trust diplomacy and we can't trust Putin. First of all, we're showing you that Russia never violated international law, which is what they reference, because the humanitarian rights doctrine of the UN Charter justified Russia's intervention in Ukraine. On top of that, they state that Putin doesn't like Putin. There's no official statement from Putin that states that he will cease fire. However, we have shown you that evidence from the June 9th Reuters shows that Putin and Poroshenko both agreed to cease fire in Ukraine and to stop aiding any separatist conflict. Now let's move on to the second contention about exacerbation. My opponents basically say that NATO's intervened. Remember that my partner showed you that their evidence specifically talks about sanctions. My opponent states that there was a unanimous vote. However, we're showing you that there is conflict of interest through France, Germany, and Italy, who are all aiding Russia in attacking Ukraine. And on top of that, we're seeing they talk about fiat power. However, remember the problem is that if NATO is ineffective and there are major harms to NATO intervention, we do win today's debate because there are absolutely no benefits of NATO intervention and there are many harms. Now let's go on to the third contention, which talks about a backlash to Afghanistan and Iran, which my opponents completely dropped, so you must extend this throughout the debate. Now let's go on to the affirmative, where they talk about NATO intervention and how we annexed Crimea. First, we are showing you that we went into Crimea because of a civil war, and furthermore, Russia denounced support for pro-Russian separatists over there. So basically what we're seeing from this is that there is no longer a threat of Russian aggression in Crimea. On top of that, they talk about military help. Remember that we have turned their answer to my partner's Quasic's question about how military intervention leads to aggravation and backlash. So remember that this goes against their first and second contentions, and for all these reasons, I strongly urge a negation ballot.
Spain and Italy and Greece have sent to Russia, would you say that Russia considers this aid important?
So France, Germany, and Italy are actually providing Russia with military supplies as part of their economic ties. Like you brought up in the last crossings that we should increase economic and military ties. We already proved that military ties cause aggression, but on top of that, think of it, if NATO goes and breaks those economic ties with Russia, Russia would feel betrayed.
Russia receives important aid from nations such as France, Italy, and Greece.
And Germany, yeah.
Okay, so essentially what my opponent has just conceded is that Russia receives important aid from these NATO member countries, allowing NATO's specific strength over Russia.
No, the point what we're trying to make here is that Russia, because they're doing trade agreements with these countries, for these countries to break the trade agreements and to betray Russia by using economic sanctions or whatever you advocate for to hurt Russia, we therefore anger Russia and leads to backlash.
Again, you've never provided any direct statements saying that these countries are actually have some sort of dependent relationship on Russia because of the military. But you don't have any statement because of this military assistance.
Helicopters and other military aid to Russia.
Look, you have to bear in mind, in accordance with the fiat power of the affirmative in debate, we're not debating whether or not an actor would be willing to pursue a policy, but whether or not they should.
Here's the problem with fiat power, because fiat power says you can do whatever you want with NATO. Sure, you can do whatever you want with NATO, but the economic ties are going to exist either way. And by breaking those economic ties using your fiat power, you're making the wrong decision, because then you actually sever them and cause Russian backlash, regardless of that you have any control over NATO.
Russian backlash. What is the maximum capability of this Russian backlash?
Well, we're showing you that Russia can backlash to cut off the northern distribution network and leave 50,000 troops stranded in Afghanistan.
Again, and on top of that, provided a direct impact as to why this is more impactful than further Russian aggression.
But realize that further Russian aggression does not exist.
Would you answer me this? How do you have any means of, or any warrant showing that NATO would simply leave those 50,000 troops stranded there?
No, NATO would
logically speaking, wouldn't you
and they would
agree?
Be killed by insurgents and protesters.
Okay, one, do you have a warrant for that? Two,
yes.
Wouldn't you agree that NATO would pursue other safer means of withdrawing troops from the area?
What are these safer means?
For example, removing troops via air transportation or naval transportation.
And NATO doesn't
You have
even
not-
You're essentially prioritizing money before the lives of these 50,000
No,
soldiers.
NATO doesn't have the financial capacity to do this thing.
Okay, so
NATO
NATO would put the lives of 50,000 soldiers at risk instead of.
We don't live in your utopia when you can do whatever you want with money. We have to realize that there are economic things that are going to get in our way, and we just have to live with them. We have to live with the status quo
Right,
and
but
build off of it.
you're under the impression that you're under the impression that NATO is just going to leave these 50,000 troops
No,
stranded.
NATO would have to bring them
or
through
leave
Pakistan.
them. Can I finish my statement?
Yeah.
Or leave them in some sort of Pakistani route that is going to be extremely dangerous towards their lives. Clearly, NATO is not going to do and damage the lives of 50,000
I know,
civilians.
that's why they're
so
using
clearly,
the
you can see
NDN,
that
which
the
could be
impact
cut
of your
out.
argument is
Even
outweighed.
if you take the airway.
Now, can we ask another question?
Can you please expand on this because it seems to be an important issue in today's debate?
I think we.
Yes, you may.
All right, fine.
Okay, so basic.
Oh, really? Okay. Sorry.
Okay, I believe we have about a minute of prep left. I'll just take that. Ready? Okay. So I'd first like to say that in accordance with both my opponent's framework and my own, we've won this debate. My opponent's framework being that we must prove that NATO could be successful or would be the best means. We've proven this by showing that NATO has already been successful in deterring separatists within eastern Ukraine, which, as we stated, are being armed by Russia. Secondly, as we stated earlier, Kiev has specifically requested more NATO-trained troops, meaning that it's clear that this has been successful. Additionally, if given that their defense budget is 10 times Russia, which my opponents failed to refute, they have the resources. And on our own contention, we've proved that NATO intervention would be net beneficial to the Ukraine, as well as Eastern Europe and the West as a whole. So specifically, my opponent's first contention was that NATO intervention will prevent deceleration of conflict. Again, we've shown that Russia has not increased aggression since NATO originally intervened back in April, which my opponents neglected to refute. Additionally, they never provided any warrants showing that negotiations with Russia were trustworthy. Therefore, you must not, or that does not carry weight. So my opponent's second contention was that NATO intervention would exacerbate the situation. Again, we've shown that both in the past and today, given that, one, Russia has not increased aggression since they intervened, and also NATO intervention in Bosnia was actually very successful in decreasing the level of genocide, which my opponents dropped. This is extended across the flow. Lastly, our opponents failed to provide any evidence showing, one, that Russia would actually be willing to close this supply route, and secondly, that NATO would not pursue other means. And that NATO could not afford these means, meaning that that is dropped, as well as the fact that arming Iran is illogical given Russian interests, which my opponents failed to refute. Now, in attacking against our case, my opponents stated that essentially Russia's actions were justified, but again, given that they violated Article 4 of this Budapest Memorandum, which didn't carry weight in the first place, such was not the case. And additionally, they stated that an actual military presence from NATO in the region would be bad. Again, we're not advocating for a military presence as so much as military assistance. Lastly, my opponents, in attacking against our second and third contention, stated that there is the option of diplomacy, but failed to provide any warrant showing that negotiations with Russia are trustworthy. For these reasons, we urge an affirmative ballot.
Are my judges ready? Yes. Opponents ready?
Yes.
And my partner ready. In the speech, I'll go over the major voter issues for this round. Time starts now. Give a man a fish and you feed him for a day. Teach a man to fish and you feed him for a lifetime. My opponents advocate that we give some amount of support to Ukraine, but here's the problem. Ukraine already knows how to fish. Ukraine has created its own self-sustainable solution to solve the Russian crisis through diplomacy, and here are the reasons why we win the debate. The first reason is going to be diplomatic efforts. Remember that we show you that Ukraine and Russia are already working through diplomacy. They have failed to show you any form of Russian governmental aggression since June 9, 2014. We already win the debate because they conceded to our framework where they must prove status quo Russian governmental aggression. But on top of that, realize the fact that because it's already de-escalating, even the civil war is coming to an end because Russia is working to end the civil war. We also proved to you that if NATO intervened, that would actually ruin the ceasefire agreement. Therefore, we must keep NATO out of the conflict so that way the ceasefire can follow through. Second voter issue is going to be exacerbation. We show you that these economic ties go against each other. Even if NATO acts unanimously and they use their magical fiat power in whatever utopian government that they propose, remember this is still not going to work because the fact that it's basically going to be severing these economic ties. Russia feels betrayed. More Russian backlash ties into our third argument, the third voter issue, Russian backlash. All they tell you is, why can't we do this? Why can't we do that? They never show you that we can do this air support. We prove to you that the air support would be infeasible for NATO. They can't simply say that we're valuing lives over money, but realize that they're valuing lives over money because the fact that simply we must argue what's feasible. And if something is not feasible under current economic standards, we simply cannot perform it. Then going to the Iranian backlash, remember, all they tell you is that Russia is not going to do this because they want to act against the Taliban, but realize that Russia's already working to give Iran nuclear weapons. We need to pull NATO out now before anything further happens. Final voter issue is my opponent's advocacy of military support. First they say military support, then they concede this aggravates Russia. Realize it's not necessary, Russian aggression doesn't exist. They say we can increase economic ties, that's sanctions. We show you that sanctions have failed. Then they also say that what we're going to be doing in the end is we can just help Ukraine in a very vague way. They never show you how we stop Russian aggression. They never show you Russian aggression exists. And so for all these reasons, I can see nothing but a negative ballot in today's debate. Thank you.
And many of you in the room had an opportunity to watch our special round of public forum debate right here. Your runners-up in public forum debate are From Sidney Lanier, Lyle Derden, and Lekha Sunder. Ladies and gentlemen, it is my distinct privilege to introduce you to the 2014 champions in public forum debate from the Brooks Academy, Devesh Kodnani and Ankush Swarnakar.